He threw the Molotov cocktail at the weapon team. It struck the swirling wind and smashed against the front Skaven. Within a moment, all hell seemed to break loose. An explosion of absolute ground-shaking magnificence erupted from the spot where the warp fire throwers had been. The explosion tore into the unit next to them and felled 2/3 of them from contact. Maestro's winds were just enough to keep the oxygen coming in to keep the flames lit as he moved the winds over and across the unit of now running clan rats. Together the two of them had pulled this trick a few times, but now they weren't going to be able to get away with it anymore. Maestro knew, as he at last saw the culprit for the magical spells he had seen earlier appearing through the unit of storm vermin closing on them. Grey Seer Snoutscar was unimpressed at the dismal performance from the army he had procured from the nearby Underaltdorf's council. Surely an army of Skaven wouldn't let a simple handful of humans and one halfling disrupt them from obtaining the chunks of meteorite warpstone that had recently landed nearby. It had been a simple recovery job. Now he was about to lose most of the army, and this was unacceptable. There wouldn't be enough hands to carry the pieces of warpstone back into the dens in time. What if other humans came and found it? Things would get messy and complicated for sure. More troops were needed, and the council would blame him. What insufferable ingratitude it would be. No, he reasoned, this had to be finished now, and he was the only one amongst this force with the strength to do it. A mass of green lightning crackled onto the platform and began expanding. The Grey Seer meant to drive them down amongst the Skaven below, where they would become vulnerable to his underlings. As the sphere of green energy expanded, forcing the group to step backwards towards the edge of the area, Maestro stared with determination. Because this was a magic spell, he felt a sense of responsibility to have to stop it. He readied River's edge from its scabbard, and willed the water within it to expand and convulse in preparedness. The wizard himself was a user of the celestial elements. Lightning was his forte. He knew that this particular lightning spell didn't have an infinite degree of energy. It wasn't being fed in a constant stream from the caster. He knew that if he could only force the energy in the spell to speed up its consumption process, it would burn out quickly. The others thought him mad when he began walking towards the expanding lightning energy. This was indeed an action very unlike him indeed, but this time he was confident in his knowledge that he would be right. He hoped. Maestro readied himself against the stinging ether that closed towards him. He readied his weapon. When the lightning was close enough at last, he lunged at full stretch, wincing, his eyes shut against the crackling stings from the small escaping lightning edges, and the watery blade penetrated the orb with a massive hissing burning wave of sound, as if in protest. The rubber on the handle protected the wizard, as the shock of the impact forced him onto one knee. The spell burned and crackled at an amazingly accelerated rate, but did not expand any more. Maestro had done it. As the spell faded away in crackling tendrils that became nothingness on their journey to nowhere, the wizard collapsed to his other knee. The pain in his body from the contest of arduous pressure almost too much for him. The Grey Seer lashed his tail against the ground in frustration. So he thought, they have one amongst their number almost as powerful as a Grey Seer. Then he decided he would show this wizard the true power of his honoured order. If this human wanted to see power, he would give it to him, and all of his friends. Grey Seer Snoutscar bit into the piece of warpstone he had concealed in his mouth earlier that day. This was his emergency supply, were the worst to happen. The worst truly had happened, all because of this wizard. Snoutscart's heart began beating quickly with overexcitement at what was to come, the slaughter and mayhem he would bring about. His eyes glowed green with mad power. The other Skaven even knew to take a few steps away from him in this state. Again, the warp-tinged lightning formed onto the platform, but this time from above, from a huge green glowing mass of energy. Lightning bolts tore down randomly across the entire length of the platform. Each shot singed the ground as it struck. The Grey Seer concentrated even more hateful power into it, and the bolts began tearing the stone out of the ground with each strike. Ulger was shaking a dying Skaven between his great jaws when a bolt struck him and the Rat Man equally, felling them both. Both were barely still alive, with black smoke pouring off of their burnt bodies. At the sight of this, Tobias drew his dagger and raced as fast as he could to reach the Grey Seer. He determined with some instinct that he would be able to reach the vile rat mage with one strong leap and slit his throat while he was concentrated. He wondered where such a tactic as this had come from, out of his psyche. He had almost made it, too. He was just about to jump from the edge when a bolt struck him in the top of the head. He collapsed to the floor, perilously close to the edge of the platform. The warped stone shard in his skull perhaps saved his life, acting as an interference to the power coursing in. He lost consciousness for the second time in this fight. Maestro dived behind Tordrad, who still stood tall. The wizard reasoned that if he were hit, at least Tordrad's armour would attract the worst of it. It wasn't that Maestro was consciously selfish or uncaring about others. He simply had an overly strong survival instinct, like that of a Skaven. A Skaven couldn't help being that way, and neither could Maestro. Perhaps it was some mental condition that was truly the cause of it, some psychosis or whatever it was, but such things were looked at in an unimportant light within the old world. In fact, issues of psychosis were encouraged because the communities of mankind were always under constant threat from the forces of darkness that co-inhabited the lands with them. In this case, it was a now insane magically charged rat man who sought to end the lives of the group as fast as Skavenly possible. Maestro concentrated on his own lightning cloud spell. He summoned an etheric cloud with the opposite polarity sensed within the Grey Seer's spell. Already bolts of Maestro's lightning shot down, attracted to the Grey Seer's green energy. Some of the green bolts likewise were attracted to the normal lightning from above, moving upwards to meet it. Where the impacts met, the two cancelled each other out into nothingness. Maestro held his hands over his head in a futile gesture of fear and self-preservation. The wizard's behaviour threw the Grey Seer off somewhat, with him considering it too Skaven-like to be comfortable. It was a little frightening to imagine the enemy behaving like you. How would you defeat them then, he thought. The others, including Maestro, got off with only a few small minor burns. Tordrad's sword had been struck with lightning, but instead of it burning him, the lightning had grown in power at the tip, making those nearby squint their eyes. After that, the blade had crackled with power for a while after. Maestro noted this out of curiosity, amid ducking under the Kislevite's legs for protection. Just as the last lashes of the storm came to an end, they fizzled out right on Rysandria's position. She fell and hit the floor, with one last prayer to her goddess on her lips, a vision of Shalia she swore she saw, forming before her as she closed her eyes. Maestro was in so much pain he couldn't move. Dieter was wheezing from the effort of his supernatural encounter, during what he'd remembered as being a blackout. Tordrad was in no shape to fight the rest of the army alone. Tobias, Ulger and Rysandria were not getting back up, though all seemed alive, for now. Tordrad regarded the lightning now crackling from his sword. He realized that this lightning was the normal colour, not the green the Grey Seer had created. That could only mean one thing. He was creating it himself. But how, he wondered. He didn't think to question it. He simply saw the opportunity this gave him here and now. The Grey Seer was readying to cast the same spell again, this time focusing even harder to finish the rest of them off. Maestro suddenly realized that his protective wall of flesh, bones and plate had driven off somewhere, as the sky once more became visible to him. He got to his feet and scurried after his bodyguard. After all, how was he able to guard his body if he wasn't there? Tordrad had set off at a run, towards the Grey Seer. Snout Scar saw this and used the channeled energy thus far to emit a blast of green electricity from his fingertips into the man. It struck him and he fell to one knee, shaking with the effort to keep moving. Green lightning danced across his body. His armour and clothing blackened where it contacted. Maestro suddenly passed him and reached the edge of the platform. It wasn't a good idea risking himself, he knew, but doing nothing in this case was perhaps an even bigger risk. Plus, if this Grey Seer killed Tordrad, Tordrad wouldn't be around to die instead of him at some later date, like any good bodyguard ought to, as he reasoned it. So with that, he jumped from the edge of the platform, leaping long and far in mid-air, and incanting a spell as he went. The Grey Seer barely had time to rechannel again when Maestro made contact. His staff struck the Grey Seer in the mouth, chipping one of his incisors clean off. Maestro had given himself a tiny boost of magic from below with his jump, and this allowed him to levitate over the Grey Seer's head to escape him. Or it would have at least, if Snoutscar hadn't reached a hand up and grabbed the wizard by the ankle. His taloned grip made the wizard's leg bleed. Before the evil rat man could pull Maestro down to his level or stab something sharp up at him, Tordrad was already in cutting range. He sliced his sword across the Grey Seer's nose, reopening the scar on him that had so given him the name. This cut had torn flesh right down through the mouth, revealing several of his sharp teeth. Tordrad made ready with a final stab motion, perfectly aimed to go inside the open-mouthed, screaming creature. With the last of his warp stone-induced energy wearing off, he quickly forced out a final teleportational skitter-leap spell on himself. Within the next moment, the Grey Seer appeared out of sight behind a tree in the distance. From there he scampered away, ringing the small high-pitched bell of retreat and regroup, so that the remnants of his army would hear it and come. Soon all of the Skaven had gone. Clan Eshin were already preparing agents to drop in at the scene when the humans had evacuated the area, so that they might dispose of the many Skaven bodies that lie about here. After all, keeping the Underfolk a mystery, an old wives' tale to the majority of humans, was the safest course for them. Less attention meant more prosperity within the Under-Empire, until the time was right for all of Skavenkind to show itself, when the final great war would come, and the Skaven would inherit all, as was the promise of the great horned rat all those years ago. Amazingly, none of the party had died. Some had come close. Rysandria had later spoken of seeing Shalia herself appear to her and tell her to return to her home, to Nuln, and there lay proper monument to her goddess. Rysandria was firm in purpose now, resolving that her deity had entrusted her with a holy mission of faith, and she would not be found lacking in accomplishing it. Therefore, even though this disturbance had happened, she was still resolute about reaching Nuln. The group collectively decided that they would head back to Altdorf first and rest. The girl they had rescued, Anastasia, she had no home left. Those in her village had turned on her, and she had nearly been killed in the Skaven attack. The only reason she was now safe was because of this group. She instantly hit things off well with Tordrad, having Kislevite blood roots in common at least. Therefore she decided she would go with them for now, until such time that she could be taken to Kislev. Tordrad was notably not very eager at the prospect of the group being the ones to perhaps take her. Rysandria wondered at this, thinking it strange that he might not want to see his home again. She believed that all of Kislev's countrymen were a proud people, detesting the Empire in comparison to their place of birth, but for now, Anastasia didn't mind where they went, as long as she was with them. This group were indestructible in her opinion. Were that only the case. 150 years ago, the Celestial College. Seer Magister Artweeb gasped in realization. The others nodded grimly. They all recognized the woman from the future vision as seen by Tristram back in Middenheim. This certainly did not bode well, and it gave the Council a new timeline for attempted concentration to deal with. Perhaps now the end of the world really was coming, they considered.